Hi, this is Jackie Patterson. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and have this conversation about organizing across movements, advancing systems change through collective visioning and action. This really is going to be a reflection of our analysis as the NAACP, as climate justice movement folks, and as environmental justice movement folks. So, giving you a bit of a sense of the analysis, a bit of the impetus for organizing across movements, some of the foundational principles for organizing across movements, and then also some of the outcomes of what it looks like to organize across movements, and then leaving us with a few discussion questions to contemplate thereafter. So really starting with looking at the deep and structural underpinnings that mean that the distribution of effects of the drivers and impacts across the climate change continuum are both geographically based and sociopolitically rooted. We have to advance overall systems change in order to have a society that affirms all rights for all people and preserves the earth on which we all rely for our very existence. Studies show that zip code is the number one predictor of environmental health. Evidence also shows that the most significant determinant of which zip codes will host toxic facilities is race. And so then we begin to right away see some of the connections in terms of structural inequities that result in the uneven distribution of impacts of environmental injustice, and also those same environmental injustices. The facilities that cause those environmental injustices are also drivers of climate change. An African American family making $50,000 to $60,000 per year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $10,000 to $15,000 a year. One example of these toxic facilities is the thousands of coal-fired power plants that are the number one contributor to the carbon dioxide emissions that drive climate change. Over 78% of African Americans live within a 30-mile radius of coal-fired power plants, which also emit toxins like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, other co-pollutants on top of their contribution to carbon dioxide emissions that also harm human health. And 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of EPA air quality standards. And that's even more appalling because we know that the EPA air quality standards are not enough thanks to the anti-regulatory lobbying that happens out there. So even the insufficient air standards that exist, 71% of us live in the counties in violation of those standards. Communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to live near multiple sources of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. They often call these pollution-burdened communities sacrifice zones because the communities that are host to coal plants, cement factories, paper mills, oil refineries, animal farms, nuclear reactors, road traffic, and more. We sacrifice the health, the well-being, and often the very lives of our residents so that the nation can waste 80% of the energy it generates, drive big cars, eat kiwi fruit year-round, eat burgers and bacon every day, and more in terms of excesses and unsustainable practices. Further along the climate change continuum, we have communities that are sacrificed for society's excesses through the impacts of climate change, including Kivalina Island, Alaska, Thibodaux, Louisiana, the Gullah Geechee Nation in South Carolina, and the nation of the Maldives Island, each of which are facing imminent displacement within 15 years due to the sea level rise. These sacrifice places include communities from Gulfport, Mississippi to Myanmar, each of which are experiencing loss of lives and livelihoods due to disaster. And these places also include places that are already food insecure, from Jersey City to the Horn of Africa, whose access to food is further threatened by shifts in agricultural yields resulting from climate change. Meanwhile, we have corporate interests that take the profits from the same polluting practices to suppress laws that will safeguard environmental health, as well as the policies that advance a more energy efficient, clean energy transition that would stem the tide of climate change. Unfortunately, these very same corporate interests are paying in thousands of dollars into groups like ALEC that not only push back on clean energy and clean air, but they also push forward on school and prison privatization and push back on voting rights and other aspects of an agenda that is all aimed towards violating civil rights, particularly of Black and brown folks and low-income folks. So bound by darker hued skin and political disenfranchisement and disproportionate impact, nations in the global South and communities of color in the global North, sometimes calling ourselves the South within the North, our communities and nations share a common cause against the moneyed Goliaths of the world. Once someone asked me with overtones of bemusement why the NAACP would be working on climate change. My response was that for a civil rights organization with a mandate to advocate on the behalf of the voiceless, the reasons in the form of politically disenfranchised nations, marginalized communities, fractured families, and the lost and damaged lives are innumerable. When it comes to a civil rights analysis, it's not equal protection under the law when we have more legal hurdles to protect big polluters than we do to protect the communities that bear the brunt of pollution-driven climate change. It's not equal protection under the law when a Navajo family in New Mexico can be polluted upon by coal-fired power plants to such an extent that everyone in the family has a respiratory illness from ingesting sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, while 70% of the people on the Navajo lands don't have access to the very electricity being generated by the polluting coal plants, and only 30% of the residents on these lands have access to running water. It's certainly not equal protection under the law when there's a breakdown in democracy that allows an entire community like Flint, Michigan to be poisoned with impunity by lead in a completely avoidable travesty that started with historic pollution and was perpetuated by non-elected, non-representational governance that prioritized finances over families. It's not equal protection under the law when the aftermath of Hurricane Isaac in 2012, which took lives and livelihoods in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana. After the aftermath, Senator Mary Landrieu was asked by the CNN why it was that Plaquemines Parish levees weren't fortified like other levees in other places in the 7 years since Hurricane Katrina took place. And she asked the Army Corps of Engineers that same question, and they said that they use a formula to decide which levees would be prioritized for fortification. And that formula applied points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if that levee was overtaken only. So these are the kind of injustices that show that there are structural, systemic measures that keep certain communities under more pollution, less protection, less fortification against the very climate change impacts that are wrought by the unfettered pollution. And so they're certainly illustrative of the deep systemic rule-bound ways that certain communities are the losers in this whole economy that we have, this capitalist economy that is largely driven by the interest of moneyed giants. So what kind of society have we built that institutionalizes the prioritization of economic loss over human lives? To invoke a resident mantra and movement that in the context of this situation certainly transcends geographic boundaries. We as oft-marginalized communities held a demonstration at the United Nations climate talks in Paris back in 2015, the historic climate talks, to call out the geopolitical, racial justice, and broader social justice intersections. Together as communities from across the African diaspora and linked arms with our allies, we declared that Black Lives Matter from Virginia Beach to Victoria Falls to Vanuatu and beyond. Therefore, we transformed we need to transform the decision-making spaces that have institutionalized this level of discrimination and really institutionalized murder in some ways by lack of protection and by actual assault on these communities of unfettered pollution. So we need to transform the decision-making spaces from the courtrooms to the zoning boards, to the hearing rooms of the public utilities commissions, to the halls of Congress, to the auditoriums of the United Nations and beyond. We must transform them from spaces where those in power are acting at the behest of corporate interests to spaces that are truly representing the needs of the people, the nations, and the planet they should serve. Starting right here in the U.S. with getting money out of politics through campaign finance reform and reversing Citizens United. While simultaneously we must be the change we want to see in the world by advancing a just transition at the local level, starting with our communities, which in the United States we only represent 4% of the global population, but we contribute up to 25% of the global emissions that drive climate change. So definitely the change must start with us who are so responsible for what's happening with communities across the world, nations across the world, and disproportionately happening in communities of color and low-income communities within the U.S. We must make fundamental shifts from a society that drills and burns to power our communities to one that harnesses the sun and the wind, from a society that buries or burns our waste to one that recovers, reuses, and recycles, from a society that genetically modifies, trucks, and ships food to one that advances local production of food that is nutritious and accessible for all. From a society that violates, commoditizes, and takes unfair advantage of workers to one that ensures the right to decent work, fair wages, and dignity in the workplace. From a society that seizes, appropriates, and defiles land for profit to one where everyone has a right to live undisturbed in a place called home, and more. We need to work across movements, as I started with, to affect these changes. Movements that include the housing rights movements that include the voting rights movements for LGBTQ rights, immigration rights, must work with movements for racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and more. Because in the end, it's all really the same struggle against power brokers who have devised systems to amass wealth and power by stoking hate and by imposing systemic oppression on the basis of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin, and more. Together we must unite to advance a radical transformation from extracting, polluting, and dominating policies and practices to regenerative, cooperative systems that uplift all rights for all people, while preserving the environment upon which, as we said, we all rely for our existence. Sorry, hopefully I'll make it through the rest here. So as we do so, we must be rooted in the principles of democratic organizing that was established at Jiménez in Mexico by various environmental justice groups and others who are coming together. So number one, we must be inclusive. Number two, we must emphasize bottom-up organizing. Number three, let people speak for themselves. Number four, work together in solidarity and mutuality. Number five, build just relationships amongst ourselves. And number six, commit to self-transformation. We've already seen it begin to happen. It's happened historically, and it's happening today. In North Carolina, the Moral Mondays movement has enjoyed multiple victories over an oppressive state government as people have united across housing rights, democracy advocates, health rights groups, environmental justice groups, and more to unite under each struggle and see that they must all stand for all rights to build power and exact change. In North Carolina, people came from movements far and wide to converge in the thousands at Standing Rock and online and through social media and beyond. And together, we were successful at stopping the Dakota Access Pipeline through the strength of the United Movement. Even though we know we've had some rollback since then, but the victory showed the power of that movement coming together. In the movement for Black Lives, we saw signs that said Asians for Black Lives, teachers for Black Lives, Unitarian Universalists for Black Lives, and so many more as people united to call for eliminating racism and holding police accountable for the state-sponsored murder of Black men and women. As we find the right to home for dreamers under attack, people are coming from all walks of life to create sanctuary cities, sanctuary churches, sanctuary campuses, while lifting our voices to denounce the notion of ousting these youth from this place commonly called America, where they have often, in some cases, had to seek sanctuary, again, because of climate-driven migration, which is forced by our very actions as the United States. As one of the biggest polluters in the world. Whether it's transition towns or eco districts or eco villages or other models, communities are uniting across differences to be the change they want to see in the world and create local systems rooted in local economies, self-reliance, cooperation, and resilience. These are just a few of the examples of the power of organizing across differences. And when we think about how to operationalize what was presented in my remarks and what I'm sure you've read in other articles and so forth, some of the discussion questions that we might consider going forward include: one, how does what was shared in this lecture and beyond illustrate the need for systems change? Two, in our own lives, what are some of the ways that we can step out of our identity silos and work outside of the movement with which we are most closely identified currently? Three, what are some of the examples of when aims of one movement may actually contradict the aims of another movement, and what should we do in those circumstances? Four, what are shared values that should exist across movements that form the basis for joint organizing? Five, as we consider self-transformation, what are the assumptions about limitations that we must push through to open ourselves up to bigger possibilities for deeper transformative work? And six, what examples do we know of where cross-movement organizing has achieved real change? So that wraps up my comments, and I absolutely look forward to hearing more. I don't know what the feedback loop is, but it's been a pleasure to imagine who's going to hear this and what might be done from it. And I hope there's opportunities to stay in dialogue in some way. But thank you so much for your interest, and take good care. Bye-bye.